The American of Adoption Congress, 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991 in Garden Grove, California. This is program number D151, tape number 18.
Know that there are workshop evaluation forms. It would be valuable for me if before you left here today you could fill them out, because then I can learn how to improve this in the future. Also, there's outlines of the workshop, and you're welcome to take a copy of those. There's copies in the front and in the back. The other thing is that there's a sign-up sheet going around somewhere on a red plastic clipboard. Anybody seen a red? It's easy to spot. So just want to encourage people also to sign the sheet. We may have a couple other folks filtering in here, but while we're waiting, I'd just like to introduce myself, and maybe we can do a little bit in the way of introductions with other folks before we start. My name is John Goldberg. I serve as the Legislative Director for the American Adoption Congress. Glad to see you all here. And just a little bit of background about me is that I've been doing activist work in one sense or another for the last 20 years. I've learned some things along the way, and I'm eager to share them. The main thing, what I'll do is find out a little bit about what you want before we start. But my guess is that we're going to spend our time with one particular tool that has to do with organizing for social change, and it's this tool, which is a strategy chart from an organization called the Midwest Academy that does training for progressive social change organizations around the country. Primarily they do training for a group called Citizen Action and some other groups. Okay, so how about if we just go around in like 2 sentences per person, say who you are, where you're from, and why you came, and then we'll decide whether this is actually the best way to spend our time. So you want to start?
I'm Jenny Snodgrass. I am from Portland, Oregon. I'm the Oregon representative to the AAC. I drafted a bill in 1989 and in 1991, both for access to records and to create a legal basis for open adoptions, and I want to figure out how to get them passed.
Great. Okay. Mary.
I'm Lee Brown from New Zealand. Have been involved with the adoption support group and movement to change the adoption legislation for about 15 years or so.
Great. Jim?
I'm Jim Brown. I'm from Sacramento, California, and I work for an adoption agency.
And why are you here today?
Interested in the subject matter.
Great. We're just saying our name, where we're from, and why we came to the workshop today.
My name is Spring Carlton. I'm from Fort Collins, Colorado. I came to get some strategies in education, really, and in affecting and changing people's attitudes on the subject of birth parents and adoption issues.
Okay, thanks.
Mark, I have a physician down Hills. I'm just interested in the subject of adoption.
Terrific.
Keith Owen, I'm an adoption professional from Alberta, Canada. I'm hoping to draft a similar bill for that province regarding open records in the next year. So I'm really interested to see how you begin this process.
Terrific. Okay.
I'm Toby Stein from Encino, California. My son donated sperm many years ago, and I'm interested in open records to find whether children.
Great.
I'm Sandra Newberger. I'm an adoptee. Just moved to the San Francisco area, and I'm interested in open records, of course.
Okay.
I'm Carolyn Austin. I'm from Boise, Idaho, search finders in Idaho, and we're trying to get ideas on how to put legislation together to change Idaho's forest law.
Great. Okay, from what I'm hearing from people, it sounds like what I had in mind will work for most folks. So how about if we give it a try and see what happens? First of all, let me see again. How many people here from California? 1, 2, 3, 4. And then so close to half the room is from California, then close to half the room is from various and sundry other places around the world. Okay, what we're going to be talking about today is power. And it's a concept that I think a lot of folks are not really all that familiar with. Basically, as I understand it, power just has to do with the ability to get things done. But what we're going to be talking about is how we can get things done as organizations of people, and specifically in relation to legislation or policy changes that have to do with, a number of people have said, I think probably half or more of the people here have said that what they want is open records, and so we're going to be focusing on that. Now we may be able to come up with some other examples as we come along. And what I want to do is just encourage as much as possible for people to just jump right in and participate in the workshop, ask questions, make statements, and we'll just make a big give and take here. The one other thing I want to mention before I start is that there is a book by a fellow named Keith, what is his last name? Griffith, right? You're very familiar with this? And I understand that it's being worked on now for publication, is that correct?
I have copies with me in the wall facility that we're looking at.
Uh-huh. Do you have one actually with you?
Not here,
Okay. Okay. So if people want to see a draft, they can see Mary, and the flyer I want to pass around is announcing the fact that this is happening, and there's a sign-up sheet down on the table where the MasterCard and Visa machine is that people can sign up for an order form. You won't be signing to buy the book, but you'll sign up for an order form. So if people want to just take a look at this, it might be a useful resource for a number of folks. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just sort of go over what the big picture of this strategy is. First of all, it seems to me that it's very important for an organization, a group of people, before they start any sort of a project for change, they need to know what their goals are. Because if you don't know what your goals are, there's really no way of knowing if you reached them or if you're going in the right direction or what you're doing. And that's the first thing I want us to spend some time on. The next thing is a whole list of organizational considerations that primarily have to do with the resources of the organization. The resources you have, the resources you need, the resources you can get. Then the next thing is things that have to do with membership and allies. People you can recruit to your cause, whether they're your folks, in other words, folks who are directly affected by the problem, or people who, for whatever reason, even though they're not actually your folks, they might want to, help to resolve the problem. And then the next step is to figure out who is it that has the power to give you what you want. It's very important. Just as important as knowing what the goal is, it's knowing who it is that can give you that. And then the very last thing, and this is where groups, I think, jump to right away, is given all of that, what are the tactics that make sense for that group of people to use to make the changes that they want? And I think a lot of times what groups do is they get a vague sense of their goals and then they just quick pick a tactic and don't think in between about, well, what are our resources and who can we recruit and who's got the power to give us what we want, and now what tactic makes sense or what series of tactics makes sense. So that's the overview. So now that I've given that overview, let's just see if there's any questions, any comments. Does it seem like a useful way to use the next hour? Yeah? I see several heads nodding and some silence. So I'll assume, without objection, that we should go ahead and use this format. Okay. So again, like I said, the first thing I think that's very important for groups to take a look at is what their goals are. So I think it's important for a group to think both long and short term. Like, what are the long-range goals of the organization? It's very important to think, how do we want to develop this organization over the long term? Because in my mind, and in the mind of a lot of people who've done organizing work in political and community arenas over the years, more than winning any specific issue, the important goal is developing the organization, building the power base of the organization so it can continue to take on bigger and bigger goals and win them. A lot of times a neighborhood group will organize to get a traffic light set up on a particular corner. And that's very important. Someone could get killed if there's no traffic light. It's a very important issue. And yet there are far more important issues that the group can get involved in if it can start drawing membership in the campaign to develop, to get that traffic light. So not only do you look for the long-term issues for the organization, but also the long and short-range goals for the issue. So what I want to do, just because we got a number of folks here who are interested in the issue of open records, I just want to use that as the example and ask us, what would the long-term goal for open records be? What do we want? Okay,
What is
okay,
that?
what is that? What is open? Okay, we want open records. Now, what does that mean?
Okay, what it means is that the records are no longer sealed and you can have access to your records, whether it's adoptee or birth family or any member of triad actually. And not be treated as a criminal when you ask for information that you need.
Okay. Anybody have any different definition of what open records are?
You could get information.
Okay.
It needs to be said as access to records. We don't want open records. We don't want Joe Blow off the street getting
Mhm.
into our records. But we want the triad and other family members to be able to get it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so actually, sounds like a part of your goal is to maintain privacy from the public. Is that accurate?
That's true, yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have a definition of open records that's any different than
And
any of these
have it
things?
direct without consent.
Okay, direct access without consent. Okay, now let me just point out, I don't think I want to spend too much time on this, but let me just point out that we actually have some contradictions in here. Because we had one person who said that open records is not having the records sealed. But then we had somebody else saying that we want to maintain privacy from the public. So see, I don't think it's important for us as a group today to resolve any contradictions in our own thinking. But the point I want to make is that as far as I know, most groups around the country, in the various states around the country and in provinces in Canada, I don't know, I think folks down in the South Pacific have things a little more worked out than we do, but people have not really figured out what they mean as a group, what they agree on as a definition for open records, and I think we need to do that. And I think it's very important for groups and state coalitions of groups to sit down with each other and hammer out the details. And I want to tell you that in Ohio, we're working on that right now, and we're talking about some serious hammering. We got different folks on different sides of the triad who want different records open to different people at different times. And we're doing
the
some
same
fights
thing
about
in
it.
Oregon.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's a very healthy
And
process.
what records?
Right. The question then becomes, what records are available to who, when, and under what circumstances? And of course, certainly you have to ask yourself a lot of why questions along the way. But we've had, we've had some pretty heavy arguments about this stuff. And what I want to say is I think it's very healthy to do that. And it's crucial, because there's no way we're going to get a state legislature to agree about open records if we can't even agree upon it among ourselves. If we can't get birth parents, adoptive parents, or at least the progressive adoptive parents and adoptees to agree on a common definition of open records or equal access or whatever we want to call it, I can't imagine how we could get a whole state legislature to do that. So I think it's a very important step in the process. So let's see if there's anything else. Oh, any questions or comments about this before we go on?
That is one of our goals. is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
I want to just use that as an example. And you can do this chart with any goal or set of goals you want to use it with, but I think this is a good one for us at the moment. Okay, so the other thing I want to say is that on this chart here, what it says, and I think it's valuable to look at, is some criteria for deciding whether you've won or not. Oh, there are, there are outlines of the workshop and workshop evaluation forms in the front and back, and also a sign-up sheet, and I want to encourage you to use all those things. Okay. So some criteria for deciding whether you're being successful or not. And one thing I think is important is, will the goal, for choosing a goal, will reaching that goal provide concrete improvements in people's lives? I think that's very important. People primarily operate out of self-interest. We have a certain degree of altruism, but people often, to a large extent, operate from self-interest. And if they're going to get some concrete improvement, they're going to work harder for it. And they should get something for their work, right? If we're going to put energy into it, we should get something out of it. If it's just some ideal, some fuzzy concept, people aren't going to work very hard. But if they realize, if somebody realizes, I'm going to get my birth certificate, right? Or I'm going to get my kid's birth certificate. That's concrete. That's something. The next thing is, will it give people a sense of their own power? In other words, if we were if we came to a common decision about what we meant by open records, and we were saying, well, should that be our goal as a group or as a state coalition of groups? Will it give people some concrete improvement in their lives? Will it give them a sense of their own power? And you ask yourself the question, if we have a bill, and we get the bill passed, and we get the whole legislature and the governor, to go along with this bill, then will it give people a sense of power? Would it? In your state or wherever you're from, would that give people a sense of power who fought for that?
Sure.
Then by that criteria, it's a good goal. If it's just, if you just ended up with some policy statement that the state thought it would be a good idea if people had access to their records, they wouldn't get anything concrete, and I'm not certain they would get a feeling of power out of it. Right? And why is that important? Because then we got more battles. Ginny said, this is just one goal. A lot of people are very concerned about the issue of family preservation. I am. And that's a very important goal. And we need to be building, I think, for all the things that we want to accomplish. And the last thing is, will it alter the relations of power? Right now, as far as I'm concerned, the National Committee for Adoption has got all the power as far as setting the agenda for access to records in this country. Because they've set the agenda. Their agenda is mutual consent, voluntary registries. And approximately half the states have that or worse, right? And we've got very little power. In Kansas, there's a lot. Who was I telling before? My favorite law, was that? My favorite law is in Kansas. Short and sweet, one sentence. It says, such sealed documents may be opened by the state registrar only upon the demand of the adopted person if of legal age or by an order of the court. Now, it doesn't include birth parents, and I think it should. It doesn't include adoptive parents, and I think it should. And maybe some other relatives as well. But at least as far as adoptees are concerned, it's a nice law, right? And it maintains privacy from the public, right? It's only by the adult adoptee or by the court, right? Not by the Wichita Tribune or, the nosy neighbor, right? Just by the party who's concerned. So what I'm trying to get at here is the business about the relationship of power. And right now, the folks who are on the other side of this issue have the power because they've got things pretty much the way they want them. We want to change that. So in the process of organizing, working for bills, bringing in new members, and winning some of these battles, we start to alter the relationship of power. If we pass a law in California or in Oregon or any other state that says that now the records are available in some fashion such as this, we've changed the relationship of power. Now instead of us having to fight to get things changed, they're going to have to fight to get things changed the way they want them. And if we've got, if we've augmented our membership in the process of the battle, then it's going to be harder for them to make that change. Okay, so then you can also look at short-term or partial victories. I mean, getting the bill written is one thing. Getting it introduced is another. Getting it through the first committee, through the first House or Senate, onto the other chamber in the legislature. Each of those are short-term victories, and I think they need to be celebrated. Hooray, we did something valuable here, right? Because if you just wait until you win your final goal, it's like people burn out. People get tired. People get frustrated and hopeless. And it's important to acknowledge when we win stuff on the way. Okay, so any more questions or comments or discussion about the issue of goals before we go on to resources or other things?
I think that short-term goal is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to say that you're one step further than you were before.
Right, right. Yeah, because sometimes it takes years to get stuff through legislatures. And if you get some, if it's the first time you ever got a bill through a committee, hey, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's time to celebrate.
Having a committee hearing.
Right,
That's an accomplishment.
just right, because if we get, I was talking
3 years ago, we
Mhm.
couldn't even get a hearing. We had a hearing.
There you go. There you go.
We were one
Mhm.
step farther than
Mhm.
we were before.
Yeah,
And it was easier getting to this step than it was 2 years ago.
There you go. It should be easier next time. Right. And like in Ohio, they passed it through the House last year, but it didn't get through the Senate. Well, at least next time it ought to be easier to get it through the House, right? And in fact, what Jim was saying earlier to me was just that if we can just get these issues out in the public arena to be debated, that's a step in the right direction, because we as a society need to make agreements about what's appropriate. Right now, there's just a lot of silence about the issue of access to records. People aren't talking about it. People aren't thinking about it. And we need the public to be thinking about it. And I think if we get the public to think about it, that they'll come to our side. Yeah.
Can I just add, when you talk about goals, that you actually, in your long-term goal, also plan for what will happen after the legislation change.
Implementation.
Because you will actually find that
The work only begins after the goal of open
Uh-huh.
records.
and the mapping of ranking will probably come. So long-term goals will need to include having a viable organisation to participate in the implementation.
Yeah, I think that's
And
very
watchdog.
important. Very
Make sure
important.
they don't come back
Yeah.
and close it.
Okay, well, let's go on to resources. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that just listed on here is any campaign that an organization conducts has got to require some money, some staff, whether that be paid or voluntary staff, some kinds of facilities. You need some space to use as an office. It can be in somebody's house, but you got to have something you can put some paper on and something you can, you know, a place to put your telephone and, pardon me?
There's a wall to take papers.
Yeah, you got to have a wall to take papers to, and in today's society, you probably have to have a computer to have any kind of campaign, right? And you have to have a desk to put it on. So, I mean, some kinds of resources need to be available, and you need to budget for that. And what I'm finding is, what I've been hearing from a lot of groups is, they don't have budgets. They just sort of spend, I mean, I was a member of the Adoption Forum. I was on their board for a year or so. We didn't have a budget. I felt pretty embarrassed about the fact that we couldn't get it together to have a budget. How does an organization know what it's got or what it can spend if it doesn't have a budget? So the organization as a whole needs to have a budget, and in addition, you need to figure out a budget for the campaign. How many letters are we going to have to write? What's it going to cost to print them? How many stamps are we going to have to get? You know, how about the long-distance phone calls? How many trips to the state capitol? Or whatever it is it's going to take. You have to look at that stuff. Were you going to say something, Sonia? No. Okay. Okay, so let me just ask here, let's just talk about this now. For any of you from your own groups. Ways, what I want to point out is that just now I've been talking about, you know, it costs something to do a campaign. But the truth of the matter is that you can also use a campaign as a way to bring in resources to the organization, new leadership, more money, membership, etc. So what I want to do now is just ask people here, in the groups that you're with, how many, I'm just going to run down the list here, how many leaders are there now? How many people who are actively in leadership positions in your organization working on these issues right now? Any of you, just sort of say. Okay, so we got leaders, 5. Anybody else want to volunteer? How many they got?
6.
6. Uh-huh.
I think we've got 5.
5. Okay, great. And that's probably what you need to start with, right? You need one person with an idea, and they talk to a couple more, and pretty soon you got 5 in a room, and now you got the makings of an organization. That's great. Now, how many leaders are you going to need to win? How many leaders will you need to win a bill in your state?
10.
In where you are, right? Okay, so we got 10 here. How about any of you who said you got 5 or 6? Will 5 or 6 leaders be enough to win, or do you going to need to develop more leadership? And if so, how many more?
You need more.
Probably doubles at least.
Doubles. And you were the 6, right? So you need 12. You got any estimate, either of you, about how many you might need?
I don't know that I understand where you're going.
Okay. Well, let me throw one concept out. I'm just thinking about, well, what would it take, right, in a state? It seems to me that what you need 51% of your legislators to vote for the bill. So it seems to me that one theory would be that you need one leader in each of at least half of the legislative districts.
Okay.
Now, I'm not sure that's true. I'm just putting it out there as something to ponder. Okay? But does it seem reasonable? Seem like?
Yes.
Okay. So how many legislative districts are there in
60.
60 House or Senate?
60 House, 30 Senate.
Okay. And do they overlap? I mean, in other words, are they inside of each, like are the House districts inside the Senate districts?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So if you have 60, then maybe you need 30. Does it seem reasonable to say maybe you need 30 leaders to get a bill passed?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Okay, so 30. How about, and that's Oregon, and you're from Idaho. Okay. So that'd be something to find out. Yeah. Okay. And how about, you're from California, right? California? You're in California? Yeah. Is that right?
Canada.
Oh, in Canada. From which province?
Alberta.
Alberta. You know how many members there are of the, what is it called, the House of
It's,
the Parliament?
no, it's provincial government. is a little
Provincial
bit,
government.
but, there's about 60 constituent ministers or
Uh-huh.
elected officials
Uh-huh.
in the House.
So maybe you need 30, but going by this theory, maybe you need 30 leaders. Yeah, maybe you don't, I don't know. But maybe. So, I mean, it's just, all I'm saying is that you can take a look at what your leadership base is now, what it might need to be, and then of course you need to figure out how do you bring people in, how do you train them, how do you empower them to take on leadership in their own areas. So what we did about this in Pennsylvania was we got our whole membership on a computer. We sat there tediously figuring out by people's zip codes what districts they lived in, and then we went through the list and said, who do you know and which one might be good and who have you met and who's articulate, and we started calling them up. It was hours and hours of work. And we ended up getting 20-something districts where we had somebody in the district that we could call and say, the bill got out of committee, it's going to the House floor, get on them, right? And we had somebody out there who had now a list of 10 of our members that they could call up and say, okay, this is the time to write the person, let's get going there. And it made, it made a difference. We made some hubbub out there because of that. Okay, so that's one thing, is leadership. Another one is membership. Okay, so how many members do some of the groups here have, represented here have? Anybody?
75.
Okay, 75. Anybody else?
Bona fide actual
Members,
members.
yeah, members.
I have probably 15.
15, okay. Any other groups have memberships they can report? Okay, that's fine. We can use these two
But I'm in
examples.
contact with the 350.
Right, okay. Okay, so then the next question would be, obviously, how many members do you need to win a bill? Like how many members do you need to win a bill?
I would say that a legislator would need to hear from at least a half a dozen constituents.
So
you're
that's
gonna
6,
take-
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would say, in theory, you really should take, the full 60 times 6.
Mhm.
Need 360 people.
So that'd be 360 members,
Yeah.
okay? And how about, what do you think, Carolyn?
I kind of agree with Sally, I'm going for every district in order to
And then
What-
get everyone calling so that everybody's
That's
aware of it.
the leaders, right? And then how many members do you need in each district?
Well, you need all those members to be able to call
Right.
other people, so I
Mhm.
mean, you're going to double it,
So-
at least.
You'd say you need at least twice as many members as leaders, is that right?
Right.
Okay, so you're saying you'd need at least 60. If you need one in each district to tell people to get moving, you need at least 2 in each district to contact them. Is that right?
Yeah, or, well, probably more than that, because you really need more than 2 people
Okay.
calling each
Uh-huh.
legislative
So how many?
person. So, 120,
Okay, so 4 for each.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, let me just report to you what one legislator said in a lobbying workshop that I went to one time. He said that, this was a state legislator in Pennsylvania. He said that if he got 2 letters from constituents, he considered whatever it was that they were writing about to be an important issue. He didn't say he would necessarily vote for it, but he said it would be important. Then he said that that he always votes for animal rights bills because he has 7 constituents who write him every time there's an animal rights bill and tell him. So I figure it's somewhere between 2 and 7. You got to have somewhere between 2 and 7 people that you know you can count on in every single district. Now, it depends on the size of the district, right? Because of course, if he was in the Senate, it would be he'd probably need 4 times that many to think it was important or vote for it. Because in Pennsylvania, the Senate district is 4 times as large. So how many you need? I don't know. You probably need to ask the legislators. What will it take to convince you that this is an important issue? How many people do you need to hear from? Of course, they're not all going to be swayed, but at any rate. Welcome. There are workshop evaluation forms, outlines of the workshops, and okay. And anyway, sign-in sheets, and I'd like to encourage you to use them all. Yeah.
Did they ever use a percentage of saying, like, if I receive 1 letter, I, in my mind, can say, well, this is possibly representative of 10% of the constituents in my area?
I've heard legislators say that every time I get a letter, it's like 100 people writing me, or more. I mean, they say different things, right? But yeah, if they get a letter, they're going to think there must be a lot more folks out there who think this way, because otherwise why would this person write me? If somebody wants to shut the door, great. Okay. Okay, and then money. That's another thing. Remember, we got to have some kind of budget for this to pay for postage and printing and travel and phone calls and all that kind of stuff. So how much money does any group here have that's available for a campaign to get a bill passed? Not the total budget of the organization, but an amount that can be allocated to a campaign. How much?
I have spent $62 today, and I have probably received that amount again in free printing.
Okay, so
To date, I've spent
and in kind. That's another very important thing. And also volunteer services are another in-kind donation. Printing, volunteer services, etc. So that's the whole. That would be the whole budget, right? So that's about $120.
That's what's
So-
in it now.
Right. And okay, that's how much you have now, right? Okay, 120.
And
Over how long a period? Is this in the last year?
this is since January.
Since January. And the bill is, at this point, where's the bill?
Dead in the committee on the first side in the House.
Dead, meaning it got voted down?
They're not going to consider it any further.
They said, we're not gonna. Does that mean the campaign is over for this bill?
No, because we're going to do our Law Day demonstration
Uh-huh.
and try and get them to finish. The
Mhm.
hearing was only half done.
Okay.
We're going to try and get them
Oh,
to
okay.
finish the
That's right,
hearing.
yeah. Okay, so 120 so far, could be more money will become available.
If we just finish getting it
Mhm.
through the House side the way I said, we probably need another $50.
Uh-huh.
And then we need to do that all over again on the other side.
Okay, so that's how much you think it'll take you to get the bill passed in Oregon, money.
Very
And-
minimal,
and-
skimpy,
Right, bare bones.
bare bones.
Okay. Okay, fine. Anybody else have money that's been expended or is available to be expended for a campaign for a bill in your area? State, province, country, whatever it is.
The groups in Colorado together to get the intermediary system in the way it is now, which I don't really like, but
Mm-hmm.
which limits adoptees have to be 21 to get information in an intermediary system that goes
Mhm.
in, does the searching,
Mhm.
and if the birth parent, or either one of the birth parents says no, the records are sealed and nobody gets no information.
Right, uh-huh. And what
They
did- what did it
spent
take?
about $4,000, $4,000 to $5,000.
Okay. Okay, anybody else have any information from your group about this subject?
We had no money at all, but used contributions from within the membership and got everything that free.
Contributions meaning not monetary
Not
contributions?
in money, but in resources. Someone in type, some
Uh-huh.
company allowed us photocopy.
Right.
Others allowed the postage.
Uh-huh.
So it was purely in kind.
Oh,
Again,
but,
it was-
okay, but somebody spent some money at least for the
There was a
postage, right?
value there.
What was the total, like, just, could you have any sort of a guess of what the total in-kind contribution was?
Well, no, because it's individual members who did most of their own things and paid their own.
Mm-hmm.
So in that respect, it would be an individual contribution by each person.
Okay.
And that would range from several thousand to very minimum.
There were some people, just individual people who made in-kind contributions of several $1,000s, and there were at least a few of them. So we're talking about at least 10 or more $1,000. Is that accurate?
Yes.
In-kind
And
contributions.
that included having to bring up overseas figures to build up your argument and so on. And that
Uh-huh.
was raised between the
Okay.
membership and the donation.
Okay, so there was money.
Yes.
And there was at least 10,000, maybe more,
About
about 10, maybe, just on the roughest ballpark sort of
In the
estimate.
final year or through the years?
that is through an 8-year period.
Uh-huh, okay, so it was an 8-year campaign that cost at least $10,000. Okay, great. And that was for the province or the nation?
The nation.
The nation, okay, great. And the population is more or less?
3 million. It's the size of Colorado. And
Okay.
we have 92 members of parliament. So,
Okay, so in terms of what you have to get done, how many people you have to reach and how many people you have to convince, then maybe it's equivalent more or less to one of the states that we might be
Yes.
working with here. Okay. Okay. Okay, so we got a whole range of hundreds, thousands, and quite a number of thousands of dollars that needs to be or has been spent on campaigns. And all I want to do here, and this is, and I think Mary's made a very important point. They didn't have any money when they started, and yet they raised a lot of money in in-kind contributions in the process of doing the campaign. And if you went back to those folks now and said, we have another very important issue that we need to work on, and they felt that way, do you think they might give again?
We've just had our first international conference, or national conference, Australasian one.
Mm-hmm.
And we started off with $50 in our bank account, and we finished off with a profit of $21,000.
Mm-hmm. So, and people made some contributions along the way? Is that accurate? Okay. So what we know is that once people give, what we can theorize from this is that once people give, they may well be willing to give again. And I think that's very important. I mean, it's very important because organizations need to raise money and in-kind contributions if they're going to be successful over the long term. Okay.
And don't
Okay.
be shy, and don't be embarrassed, because I end up being that way all the time. And I will show up at my printers, you know, with check in hand, ready to write it for whatever it needs to be.
Right.
And sometimes she takes it, and sometimes
Mhm.
she doesn't.
She's giving an in-kind contribution.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great.
And
I think it becomes easier over time. That we found is because we had some successful reunion. We don't see business people and adopted fathers who when we were going when he was named, you know, one of the sons who transracial adoption had lots of problems and worked out very well.
Mhm.
So he would come always, $2,000-3,000, and he gave us 10,000 for the conference. And, you know, from his organisation. So
Mhm.
there are these people.
Right.
Then you patch resolve, you get a larger member group to draw from.
Mhm.
And it
Mhm.
also makes them feel good, don't rob them of that opportunity.
Right, absolutely. People feel like I was a part of this, I contributed to it.
That's right.
And let me just say that the AAC has come to realize that it's going to be needing to raise more money to do this kind of work. At the board meeting yesterday, we decided, you know, we need to start, we need to differentiate the dues structure. So if people, not only if people can't afford to pay $40, they can pay less, but also if people want to pay more than $40, it's right there for them to do that. Start selling books to raise money and also get the word out more. Started a new project or program called the Friends of the AAC, where people are committing $100 a year for 5 years. And we had several people at the board meeting yesterday who wrote out their checks. So, I mean, this kind of thing I think is very important for an organization to start to implement to raise the money that it needs to be successful in the campaign. Okay, and then the next thing is the whole issue of internal problems. Every organization that's ever been known, as far as I know of, has had internal problems, and it's very important to solve them. And why don't we just talk for a minute here about what are some common internal problems that organizations have?
Ego competition.
What else?
Different end goals, even though you have common goals, you have different goals also.
Okay, anybody else?
Enthusiasm sometimes can get up or down.
Enthusiasm, energy.
Okay. Pardon me? Burnout? Okay, so those are just a few. But what I want to point out is that an organization, to be successful over the long term, needs to recognize what's going on there and address the issues. This one is terribly common. Not just in adoption organizations, though it's rife in adoption organizations. But it's common everywhere you see people involved in organizations. I want to be the leader forever, right? And organizations die under the, you know, controlling hand of the founder if that's the only person who leads the organization over the years. New leadership needs to come in. The organization needs to grow and diversify. And that's just one of many problems. But all I want to point out is the problems are there, and the answer is we need to look at them, face them honestly, and work on them.
And sometimes you get people who all want to be the leaders and nobody wants to be the leader.
That's another problem. That's another problem. That's right.
I'll do this, or I don't want to take responsibility
That's right.
for
Mhm.
leading this organization, or I don't want to take, most of the time I get when I've been in a lot of groups or a lot of organizations starting up, it's, I don't want to take responsibility for doing this.
Right. And an organization just can't grow and function over the long term unless some people are willing to take leadership. And of course, people can be, a lot of times I think people don't want to take on leadership because they don't really know what to do. But if people are trained,
One little job at a time.
yeah, people can be mentored, apprenticed, all kinds of things to get folks to the point where they can take on bigger tasks. Okay, yeah.
Excuse my ignorance, I mean, this is all new, it's why I'm sitting in on this.
Mhm.
I have no idea about lobbying or
Mhm.
anything. But some of this, I know we're generalizing, but some of it, like the money and the members, and we're talking about state level.
Mhm.
And is that the way open records should go, is at the state level versus the country?
Well, right now, right now in the United States, all of the laws about access to records, whether they're open or closed or somewhere in between, are all state laws. Welcome. And there are workshop evaluation forms in the front and back, also workshop outlines, and there's a sign-up sheet up here I'd like to encourage you to sign. Okay. Yeah, all of the laws about access are currently state laws. We've done this far in the outline, and again, if you want to pick up a copy, you'll see where we are. And right now, the question is, at what level do we need to address the issue of open records? And I think, for the moment anyway, it makes sense to address it on the state level. Maybe the federal government could pass a law on that subject. It could certainly pass a model law and then not fund states that followed that law. But I'm not aware. Is anybody here aware of whether know definitively whether the federal government has the power to pass a law that says that the records need to be open in all the states?
I think it has to be a constitutional issue.
Yeah, I don't even know.
And directly approached
Yeah. Jim?
under that level.
It's conceivable they could pass a law that would bind you if you wish to have certain federal monies.
Mhm.
But as to pass a law to deal with the issue and dispose of it as a general issue, I don't believe they can do that in the Constitution.
So it would have to, so as Jenny said, if it was going to be federal, it might have to be a constitutional amendment to do that. We don't really know for sure, but probably not. But we do know it can be done.
The registry, the National Registry law that they keep
Mhm.
bannering about
Mhm.
is a federal service, not necessarily a federal law.
Right, right.
And I agree, in some ways in our minds, we think, why don't we just go take care of this federally, nationally?
Mhm.
And, all of
Mhm.
us just kind of get together and, start working at the Washington DC level. But it's just like in our state levels, and like in Oregon, we've got the Grants Pass, which is area real well covered. We've got Eugene real well covered. We've got Portland real well covered. But, half of our legislators,
Right.
not necessarily population, is outside of that area. Right now, we've got a very small part of our legislators covered as far as this phone tree and what have you, saying, okay, now we got to get it moving. And to, get the membership in the rest of the state, I don't even have on my list of people, people for every single solitary legislator, let alone people who communicate. You're going to run into the same thing at state level, I think, too, that you're not going to have individual leader members who are going to be able to lobby at a national level. And people get real intimidated when the higher up the ladder you go. I'm also president of our neighborhood association, and we're trying to stop the stoplight, not put it in. The people will work at a little tiny city council level, but then, the farther up you start going, the more fearful the individual citizen becomes. I would like to see us tackle it nationally, but we're going to have the same problems nationally that we have at the state level.
Actually, you asking that question reminds me of something that
This is the end of side A. Please turn your tape over and continue on side B.
National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws, which is writing a model state adoption act, which will address the issue of access to records. And that act will be proposed to all 50 states. Now, not to say that they will necessarily be introduced. They probably will be introduced. Whether they get passed or not, we don't know, right? But it is an opportunity to try to influence legislation all over the country. And the National Committee for Adoption, which is on the other side on this issue, has advisor status with that conference, and they're advising them that the very best thing would be a mutual consent voluntary registry. We're right in that. We got observer status. And first they weren't going to let us speak, but then we said, no, wait a minute here. And then they decided they would let us speak. And of course, we're advising them that we want what we're saying is we want every triad member to have the same access to records about themselves and their children as any other citizen in the United States. So whether that happens or not is going to depend on how much pressure we can put on the members of that conference to pass that. And I think it's a very high priority. The AAC board yesterday considered this very carefully, and we said we're going to commit some resources to this. We're going to make a campaign out of this. Yeah. And the guy who got most of the motions passed at the last meeting of this conference is an adoptee. He's not for open records. He's for, he was a North Dakota state legislator, and he's the guy who introduced and got passed the law there, which is sort of a consent denial intermediary system where you can either consent or deny, and if neither one are on file, then the state sends an intermediary to ask you if you consent or deny to the release of your information. He's not opposed to open records, he just doesn't support it. So we're trying to convince him. That's the first step. We have to convince him. Just like I said, we have to agree among ourselves, including this adoptee, right, that what we want is open records. So I want to give you his name and his address. And I want to encourage everybody here to write him a letter and tell him whatever it is, why it is that you think we ought to be having open records, because this can be very important. The guy's name is Mike, and I'll have to spell his last name for you. It's very difficult. It's Unjem, U-N-H-J-E-M. And his address is 4510 13th Avenue, Southwest, and that's in Fargo, North Dakota. And the zip code is 58121. Anybody need any part of that again? And let me tell you, he will read the letters and he will consider them. Because when we were working on that committee meeting a few weeks ago, and we didn't have anybody we could call in North Dakota to get on this guy, I called the Cub chapter in Minnesota. And the law that he had passed was based on the Minnesota law. And he got letters from 6 birth mothers who said, we want open records. We don't want what we have in Minnesota, we want open records. And he read them and he considered them.
He's going to be at the commission.
He's a member of the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws and a member of their committee, which is drafting this Adoption Act. And he's the mover and shaker on the committee. He's the guy who made the motions about access, he's the guy who argued for him, and he's the guy who got his motions passed. So we need him out there making motions for open records and not for all this bureaucratic mumbo jumbo. That's what I think. So, any other questions or comments about any of that? I don't know where we were, but where we were. I guess at the end of that. One more thing I want to mention before we go on. And it's something I usually mention at the beginning of a workshop, but I forgot, so I'll do it now. I used to say this sort of looks like the peace symbol, but I guess the peace symbol, no, it doesn't look like a peace symbol, doesn't it? The Mercedes symbol, all that kind of stuff. Okay, it's not peace, it's not Mercedes. It's just, it has a little something to do with group dynamics. And what I want to point out is, it has to do with how much space, conversation space, people generally tend to take. Usually what happens is you got one person in a group who takes about 40% of the conversation space. And then you have another person in the group who takes about 20% of the conversation space. So between the two of them, they've now got about 60%. And then however many more people you have in a group, whether it's 1 more or 2 more or 400 more, they all get to share the rest of it. So what I want to do is encourage people who tend to be the big talkers to tone it down a little bit. And I want to encourage the people who generally don't speak up to speak up. Because, I mean, this is about empowerment, right? So, and one of the ways you get power is to speak up about what you believe in. So I want to encourage you to ask questions, to make comments, to jump right in. And the only fear I have when I say this is, it's usually these folks here who end up with no conversation space at all. When I say this, they think, oh, I'm probably talking too much, and then they shut up. So don't do that if you're, don't do that. Okay, should we go on to members and allies and all that kind of stuff? Okay, so one thing is I want to say here, we've got actually 2 groups of people that we can count on, or we can try to get in our fold to count on to work with us. One of them is a group of people who I would call members, and another one is this group of people that I would call allies. And I want to define as the difference, members are people whose lives are directly affected by the problem. The people who live there and are concerned about the traffic light. The people who don't have their birth certificates. The people who, whatever the issue is, the people who are directly affected by it. Those are the folks who are most likely to actually join your organization and be a member. Now, in addition to those folks, there's a whole lot of other folks who might want to help for whatever reason. They may not live there and be concerned about the traffic light. They may not have any problem getting their birth certificate, but they might have some reason to want to chip in and help the cause, right? So let's talk about who might the members be for our cause of open records, and then who might the allies be. So let's start with the members. Who can we look to be members of our groups about the issue of open records?
All members of the triad.
Adoptees, triad members, who else?
And their extended family.
Extended family.
And their organization.
Pardon me?
And their organization.
When you say their organizations,
Well,
organizations of adoptees, triad
support
members,
groups.
support groups. Okay, now somebody mentioned social workers, and I want to ask the question, huh?
I do, but now
Well, I just want to ask the question, are they directly affected by the issue? Are their lives affected? Does the problem hurt them?
Their livelihood is.
Okay, the fact that I can't get my birth certificate, does that affect a social worker? Some people are saying yes, and I want to hear how.
I actually think it's...
Okay, how?
Well, part of a social worker's role is to be an advocate and work with oppressed people
Mhm.
and support them in their
Mhm,
change.
mhm.
So I think social workers have a responsibility in terms of their practice to have an interest in that.
Mhm.
And certainly in New Zealand, all the groups have always had social workers. Few, mind you,
Mhm.
few.
Right.
But some of them
Right.
have
Uh-huh.
have a additional. They do placements and yeah, I think they can be.
Mhm. Okay.
I very strongly agree with that.
Mhm.
And this button that is on for sale downstairs is one that you should push.
Oh, social workers for adoption reform, okay.
Really need to be involved.
Uh-huh.
And this is something that I'm going to take back to my problem.
That's great.
I want to try to do the same thing.
That's great.
I think it's
Mhm.
the only way to go.
Okay. Anybody else who might want to be a member of our group?
Extended members.
Okay, now before we move on to allies, what I want to say here is just a matter of definition. I think I personally wouldn't wouldn't put social workers in this category because I don't personally see how it directly affects their life if somebody does or doesn't get their birth certificate. It certainly affects their practice, and that's very important. I think they're allies. Those who are helping are our allies, and I think that's perfectly fine. Now, whether I don't think it's really important when you come right down to it, whether they're directly affected or they're not directly affected, except that folks whose lives are
It's not going
affected.
to change the personal structure of their family,
Families in their lives.
Probably
but
not.
it is going to change their work
Right.
and how they feel about
Right.
themselves
Oh,
personally,
yeah.
but it's not
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
change their family makeup.
Yeah. And I guess another way to look at it is just to look and say, do any of these folks need any convincing? In other words, do you have to sell the idea to an adoptee or a birth parent
Sometimes.
that they ought to? You do sometimes. That's right.
And an adopted family.
Yeah. Certainly for allies, you got to sell them on the idea. They wouldn't know intuitively that this is the right thing. Somebody would have to go to them and say, "This is the right thing because," and they'd have to
Well,
get
it
that.
depends on their training.
Do you have
Yeah.
adopted parents as part of that member group?
As triad members, yeah, but we can put them down.
I have somebody for the Allies.
Okay. Who are the
Our
allies?
petition that we have gone to for several years during our...
Who is this?
The beautician we've gone to for several years while we're doing our search.
Uh-huh.
This woman can tell you.
Okay. Anybody else who might be allies?
The Indian tribes.
We've got to start really working with them.
Okay.
They need help, they need direction.
And that goes more than one way.
Okay, and let's go back and ask both of these questions. Why would the beautician want to be an ally?
Because I think that they are like our psychologists.
And after listening to us, in my case, 3-year search,
Mhm.
I even had her making telephone calls for me because she had grown up in the same area where I
Mhm.
was doing a search myself for someone else. And so she became definitely an ally.
Mhm.
She was out there helping me do a search.
Mhm. Okay, so I'm interpreting what you're saying is that she wanted to be an ally because she had a relationship with you and she felt concerned about you. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
They become converts if they've
Right.
never had any dealings
Mhm.
with adoption
Right.
before.
Right.
Then after they listen to you for 3 years or so, they become sympathetic or
Mhm.
whatever.
Right, okay. And why would Indian tribes be concerned about this issue?
Right now, the Indian tribes in the United States are trying to build their enrollment and build their membership to
Mhm.
include all people
Mhm.
who have the right to belong to it.
Mhm.
And they are concerned about finding the Indian adoptees who have been surrendered for adoption, who may not have any
There you go.
knowledge
There you go.
whatsoever of their
Mhm.
tribal status.
Mhm.
Which
Okay.
3 out of the last 4 I
Mhm.
had no knowledge that they had Indian heritage. They're also concerned, the Kuruk tribe in California is concerned about Indians who are adopting non-Indian children and what those non-genetic Indian children.
And could you give it to
know,
those
what
folks
their
in the back
rights
when
and
you're done?
rights be. The conversations I've had with the Kuruk tribe in the last few weeks have been real intriguing.
Mhm.
And they're real angry about not being able to find
Mhm.
where all their members
Okay.
are.
Okay. Any other groups would be allies?
Legislators?
Okay, how would why would legislators want to be our allies?
Because we're their constituent.
If
Oh.
the public thinks well of the bill, then they'll think well of
Mhm.
them who are
Mhm.
promoting it.
Okay. Now, you were saying, Toby, that you think they would be. Why do you think they would be?
The legislators?
Why would they want to be our allies?
How else can we do anything without having legislation?
Right, I understand that. What I'm asking is, why would they want to be our allies? Well, I know why we want them to be our allies. Why would they want to be our allies?
Because we vote them into office.
There you go. Okay. And you were going to say something, Mary?
No, I'm saying they're the ones who have to change.
Right. They're also the targets, right? Okay. So who else might want to be our allies?
School counselors.
And why?
Because trouble kids.
Because they deal with confused kids.
Uh-huh.
It would help them to know why they're confused.
Okay, because it would actually help them in their work if the records were open and kids could find and information could be known. Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Anybody else?
The media.
The media. Why would the media want to be our ally?
Well, they get public education that influences people's thinking.
No, because it's good reading raises ratings.
Okay. Let me just ask, if somebody gives somebody who want to be an ally, somebody who might be an ally, I want to encourage us to let them have the first shot at saying why they think that might be. So why would the media?
Because I'm confused with you two and allies. It just makes sense to me.
Like, pretty much our ally.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why would they want to be our allies? Why would we want them to be our allies?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Why would they want to be our allies? We want everybody to be our allies because the more allies we got, the more likely we'll win, right? So the question is, why would they want to be our allies?
Promotion of news.
Does that seem reasonable to you?
Human interest stories are.
Sensational stories.
Yeah.
That's better than anything.
Yeah, well, maybe Mary is not convinced, but I just got convinced from several people that one thing is that they'll sell more papers and advertising time if they have interesting stuff to report in the newspaper, right? So they might want to be our allies in that sense. Anybody else who might want to be our allies? Let me mention a few. Now, we lost the doctor who was sitting in the back corner, but doctors and other healthcare professionals might want to be our allies. Because, why would they want to be?
They need a medical background.
There you go. To effectively do their work, they need the kind of health history that'll give them the information they need to diagnose and treat people in a correct manner.
Lawyers.
And why would lawyers want to be our allies?
Monitors.
What?
Well,
maybe they're not really an ally, because right now we go to them to get access to our records, which they can't even get done for it.
Yeah. But why would they want, you were saying they would want to be our allies for monetary reasons. How would it benefit them financially to be our allies in getting the records open?
Well, anytime an attorney spends time with a client, he gets paid.
Right.
Yeah, but if we have access to records, then we no longer need them.
But are we going to pay attorneys to help us get the legislatures to pass open records bills?
No. We're gonna take business away from us, is what we're gonna do.
How will that happen?
Because right now, we go to an attorney and say, you know, draw me the paperwork to get a court order to get my records. Of course, which you don't get, but they are going to lose that business.
But are you speaking after the fact? And like before the fact, lawyers are necessary in order for the laws to change.
For the process of adoption.
Well, but, okay, what we're talking about right now is trying to get the records open in these various states, presumably by lobbying the legislatures to do that. Now, is it likely that any of us would be hiring lawyers to help us lobby the legislatures?
Get open records. I don't
Pardon me?
Go to a lawyer to open my record.
People have in Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, they hired lawyers.
To make submissions to select committees on their own behalf.
And they hired lawyers to do that?
Yes, they do.
Well, so some lawyers...
Parents who are opposed to it.
Okay, so some lawyers might want to be our allies because we'd hire them to do that. Anybody else want to be? Let me just lay out a few more and let's move on. Religious organizations. They're supposed to be concerned about humanitarian things and stuff like that, and maybe they'd want to be our allies for that purpose. We have a letter, for example, from a Methodist conference in eastern Pennsylvania where they say we support your bill for open records, and that's that's good. You were going to say one?
Well, I just wondered why the right to lifers aren't supporting that.
They're against
Okay, well let's ask this.
Oh,
Let's ask this question. Might the right to lifers want to be our allies, and if so, why would they want to be?
Yes, they could.
Well, they're saying what happens to the child before it's born is important.
Uh-huh.
They're saying what happens to the child after it's born is important. And to me, we're working toward the same end.
Okay.
But yeah, so I'm really surprised that they're not, in our camp.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I think an answer to that question would be if a young woman is pregnant and then there is an option of having the records open at a later point, she might be more willing to go for adoption than rather have an abortion.
But they don't face that issue at all.
But see, what we...
Adoption is the only option, and adoption should be closed, and everybody should have their secrecy. That's what the right to lifers believe. They have bumper stickers in Fort Collins that say adoption is the only option, and then some of them have the bumpers that say, stickers that say, keep adoption records closed.
Well, now some right to lifers think that, but other right to lifers, there's a woman here who lives in this area named Karen Johnson, who's very active in the right to life movement, and she's very active in the open records movement. And I think she may well believe what you said, which is that if a woman, it's very difficult. We know, right? It's very difficult for a woman to give up her child, would never have the opportunity to know if the child is alive or well, never have the opportunity to see her child again. And I've heard women say, I would have an abortion if that was my situation. And if we can communicate that to the right to lifers, they might get on board.
I think, John, we probably should do a little bit of focusing on these groups who are against abortion and their reasonings on the abortion issue, the adoption issue. And I think we need to get some real well-spoken people to really start communicating with them, because I think the NCFA has gone after them and has them convinced.
Some of them.
I forgot to bring, I got this thing that the voice for the unborn. I mean,
right, I've seen it.
You've seen it, okay.
Attacking the Ohio.
I want to puke. The birthright and the right to lifers will not even allow a speaker from one of the search and support groups to speak to them, because this issue has already been brought up.
Well,
Don't
we're
ask me why, but I mean,
Mhm.
they don't want anything whatsoever to do with us.
we're talking to them in Ohio. We're talking to the Catholic Conference in Ohio. We're talking to one of the local chapters of Right to Life in Ohio. And our intention is to try to sell this. Now, maybe we won't sell it.
I
Right?
think that's happened in New South Wales, particularly where they had 4 pro-lifers as individual members of parliament because of the pro-life thing, and they all voted for open because they were sold the idea that closed records promote abortion.
There you go.
And by open records, more women will give up, and they promote open adoptions. You know, they say with open adoptions they will have more adoptions, and it's better than these single parents living in sin. So they have moral judgments about it, but they actually supported open records.
There you go.
Anonymously.
There you go. They could be our allies. Ethnic groups could be our allies because they're very concerned about ethnic heritage, right? You know, the Polish American Club or the Italian American Club or whatever, because maybe they could be sold the idea that, hey, you know, you got people who are of your ethnic group, they don't even know it, they don't have an opportunity for their heritage, et cetera, et cetera.
You can put several,
Religious, yeah.
like Jewish religion,
There you go.
where it has a great deal to do with who is born to whom as to your religious status.
Okay, so the other thing is, the other thing I want to say is that what we need to do is go and figure out who are all the possible groups that could help us, what groups are they organized into, how do we reach them, and how do we persuade them to be on our side. Now, we might decide that some of these groups are not convincible or not worth the time. In other words, we could get 10 others in an effort that would take us to get one. And maybe we say we don't have the resources, it's judgments we need to make. The only point I want to make here is we got to get our members, and we also have to line up our allies. Because when we're talking about the National Committee for Adoption, they got Barbara Bush as their honorary chair, you know? I mean, they got some power, right? And if we want power, we got to line up the folks. And all these, whoever, you know, these kinds of folks. Huh? Who knows? Who knows? Okay, Kathy, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say on the allies there, if we could convince adopted parents groups to hear us out, and, you know, while they still have young children, and be convinced that we don't intend to come in and steal their children. But, you know, everybody's afraid of everybody, and it's still that. And even in churches, it's more political than it is religious. And they are just in favor of adoption, not the other way.
Okay, yeah, any more on this before we move on to the next step of target?
We should write adoptive parents on this.
Um,
Or adopt on this, on the right side, as groups, adoptive parents groups.
Okay.
Because right now they're against records too often.
Some are against, some are for. Maybe more against than for, but yeah, we could win them, you know, we could sell. I mean, how are you going to responsibly parent your child if you don't have access to the information you need? Absolutely, yeah.
Well, my only comment was that adoptive parents and social workers are probably falling all 3 categories: members, allies, and targets.
Could be. Well, let's talk about who the targets are and whether they might be there. Okay, so the next thing is the target. I want to, I don't know if I'm going to really get into primary and secondary targets, but for the moment, let's just talk about targets let's talk about the target as an individual. A lot of times people think, oh, the institution, we want some institution to change. Well, institutions in and of themselves don't change. People in those institutions make decisions to change, and as a result, the institutions change. Leadership in those organizations make decisions. So what I want to ask is, who is it that has the power to give us what we want?
The legislatures.
Okay? Who in the legislature has the most power to give us what we want?
The final one would be the governor.
Okay? And then in the legislature, who has the most power to give us what we want?
The individual legislators,
Okay, but among the individual legislators.
the committee.
Okay, so we've got individual legislators, committee members, who else? Who has the
Committee staff.
committee,
No problem with our committee staff.
staff? Who else
But
has the
they-
most power? Yeah, okay.
In their synopsis to the individual legislators,
Uh-huh.
they gotta believe what they're telling their legislators.
Okay.
Their legislator comes up and says, well, what is this?
Okay.
May have to break it down.
Okay. What's the one individual legislator who has the most power to give us what we want?
Senators?
One legislator.
Our individual.
Now, there you go. That's right. You're own your district. For you, it would be yours. For me, it would be mine. In a certain sense, on one level, when you come down to the vote in the full House or the full Senate, it'd be your own. Now, in general, on a whole statewide level, what's the one legislator that has the most power to give us what we want?
Speaker of the House.
The Speaker of the House, and then there's another one.
Speaker of the Senate or?
Speaker or President, whatever the title might be, of the House and the Senate. Okay? And then on the committees, who has the most power to give us what we want in a particular committee?
Chairman.
Chair of the committee. And what I want to point out is the target is going to change from time to time, right? First, your target is going to be some legislator. You got to get some legislator to agree to introduce a bill. Then you get the bill in, the bill gets assigned to the committee. So then the chair of the committee is the target because the chair of the committee decides whether or not the bill is going to be voted on. And then if that's the case, if it's going to get voted on, then the various committee members become targets. And especially for those of us who live in the districts of those committee members, we got to work on them and get them to vote for the bill. Then it goes to the whole House or the whole Senate. And then the person who decides how the bill gets run in the House or the Senate is the Speaker or the President. You know, are we going to bring it up? Are we going to send it to some other committee and kill it? Are we going to, you know, stall it or whatever? And also, the other thing is caucus chairs. The party caucus chairs can be very influential. The Republican or Democratic, you know, caucus chairs. Because a lot of times a bill, when it gets out of committee, before it goes to the floor, it goes to the caucus. Closed room, lots of smoke. And they make deals. And the caucus chairs at that point is very important. Another thing is there can be specific individual legislators who can be important, even though they don't have a position that's important. If they're blocking your bill, you know, if they're the ones standing up there railing against your bill, then they're, you know, they're a problem. And so they can become a target. And if you can get them to shut up, you know, maybe you can get the other folks who are getting to be your allies in the legislature, they can make more
The
ground.
adoptive parent legislator who's going around telling everybody.
Right, that's right.
The
Might be.
adoptive parent lobbyist who's going around talking to everybody.
Right.
Are we allowed to blackmail them for something?
Well,
This is politics, Kathy.
well, actually tactics is the next question. So why don't we take that up there and see what, you know, see what we want to do. Okay, so I think the most important step in getting any of these people, whoever happens to be the target at the moment, to get them to be on your side is to meet with them. Got to meet with them. Huh? A power lunch. There you go, with a red tie. So that's what I think that's the most important first step is you got to arrange a meeting with this person. So suppose it's the Speaker of the House or the President of the Senate or the Governor, and you call up and you write a letter and you ask for a meeting and you don't get a meeting. What can you do?
Contribute.
Say?
Contribute.
Contribute to,
The
Their
campaign
campaign.
and then how will that get you to your meeting?
Well, I know people have been very successful at it.
Uh-huh.
In getting their legislation passed. I
Uh-huh.
mean, the developers.
Right,
certain
right.
communities.
And why do they get the meeting or the legislation passed?
Why do they get preferential treatment?
Yeah.
Well, because they're giving them money. I mean, that's what they need to stay in power.
Right, there you go. And so if the thing is that then by giving them money, you have power over them, right? See, right now they got power over us because they can decide whether the bill gets heard or whether it gets passed or whether it gets signed or whatever, and we need to figure some way to get power over them. And the first thing is we need to get a meeting.
Political position.
Wait, let's have one person who wants to, you know.
I think petitions help too.
Okay, we're going to talk about tactics in just a minute. What I want to do right now, now I've sort of lost my train of thought, but what I want to do is how is it that we get the meeting with the person? Yeah.
I think better than giving them money, because I know in my case with my legislator, he would accept no money from me.
Uh-huh.
But if I had volunteered to have a tea at my house, or work on his campaign,
It's
you know,
back
in
to
our
votes.
area, or, you know, any of these kinds of
Time
things.
and energy.
That I think that to me is more honest and better than giving him money. Because I think unless we can give him thousands, and we're not talking, you know, big bucks here, he's not going to recognize us too much.
Okay, so
Political
ways that
influence.
people could, we've heard so far, that people could get a meeting with somebody is to make campaign contributions, raise money for them, volunteer in their office. Now, what about political influence?
My legislator
Mhm.
finally decided to cooperate with
Mhm.
me because I got the people in my neighborhood calling him, telling him that they thought that my bill was good.
Mhm.
And they had nothing to do with adoption, but they were his constituents and Tom and Mike,
Mhm.
you know, you use your political power in other areas
Mhm.
to influence it.
I got it.
Okay, I've got political power in my little
Mhm.
tiny town.
Mhm.
My mayor last night met with a legislator that is giving me a bad time
Mhm.
up there to tell him he
There you
better
go.
shape up.
There you go. Yeah,
And
so,
and it's all a stair-step process, and, you know, legislators want votes, whether they get it through political influence,
Mhm.
media attention,
mhm.
dollar contributions or people, you
Mhm.
know, contributions,
Mhm.
and I think we have to look at people,
Mhm.
individual, what can I do to help you
Mhm.
campaign?
Mhm.
And I've helped these people campaign for office,
Mhm.
just so that I've got, it's politics, and we've
Mhm.
got to play the
Mhm.
political game.
Mhm. Okay, so the point I want to make here is that if you can't get a meeting with them, then you have to some way either become a person who can get a meeting with them, has some influence over them and get a meeting, or you have to go to somebody else who has influence over them and have them arrange the meeting, right?
His
So,
persistence of keeping you, the name, the bill in front of them all the time.
And let
if
them know that
there's
you're going to get them voted out of office if they don't
persistence,
cooperate.
if there's power connected with that persistence. If they just think, oh, that's just some nobody and they're not ever going to do anything just because they write me all the time and call my office, I don't care. But if you've got a bunch of folks calling, or you've got the mayor calling, or you've got whatever, then you've got some influence, and you can probably get your meeting. Yeah. There was one over here, and did you have one?
I was going to summarize what she was saying, is that like, they need votes, and if you get a large group of people that may be
There you go.
their
Right.
possible office,
Right.
they will listen.
Mhm. Okay, so let me just, do I want to do, actually we only have just a few more minutes. So let me just say that that's the important thing. Figure out who's got the power to give you what you want. You got to go meet with them and say, you know, we want this, and hopefully you're going to negotiate and they're going to end up saying yes. If you can't get a meeting, you've got to either become somebody or go to somebody who has influence over them to get the meeting. So once you do that, and if they say no, or if you need some tactics to help you get the meeting in the first place, then you got to think about what tactics do you want to use. And the point I want to make here is that the tactics, I think it's very important for the tactics to be in context, in this context. They have to fit with the goal of open records, with the idea of building up your resources and the resources that you have now. They have to fit with the allies that you have. In other words, these are some of the folks who maybe can help you get that meeting. And they have to fit with who the target is. All those things, I think it's helpful to keep all those things in mind while you're doing that. So, and what I want to point out is that lots of groups, and let me just say that I worked in the peace movement for a number of years, and I think the peace movement really falls down on this point. Lots of groups, when they got a goal, they got something they're bothered about, the first thing they do is they don't even think about all this stuff. They say, let's go have a demonstration. Right? That's the automatic response. Let's go have a demonstration. And I'm not knocking demonstrations. I think demonstrations are great things. I think they're very valuable tactics. But the question is that the right tactic in this particular circumstance? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. It might depend on who you want to meet with. It might depend on who your allies are, whatever. So let's just take a minute here and list some possible tactics that we might use, and maybe we'll take a moment to evaluate those, and then we're going to get out of here. So what are some, so the first one is, everybody knows you could have a demonstration. So what else could you do to get these folks to move?
By demonstration.
Okay, okay, you can have a dignified demonstration, or you can have an undignified demonstration. You could have demonstrations. What other kinds
But
of
see, I
tactics?
don't think
What-
undignified matches over there.
Maybe it doesn't. All I'm doing right now is asking people to list possible tactics that we could use.
Petitions.
Petitions. What else could we do?
I think it would be important to be able to have your information together as to why your goal is so important, and why you need the support. You know, like numbers, how many people are involved, how many, I don't know exactly everything you would need, but I think it's important to have numbers.
Okay, yeah.
Public education.
You can also use media as well.
Letter writing campaign?
In a timely manner.
Okay, any other tactics we could use?
We have questions raised in the House.
So this is like House debate, is that what you're saying? Okay, let me just, I'm, for some reason or other, I'm drawing a little bit of a blank right here, but let me just remind myself. If anybody else, say more. If you have any other ones that come to mind, just throw them right out. Any other tactics we can use?
Well, it would not be targets, but go to other people to persuade the one that's putting out the roadblock. Convince the other people to convince them.
Right, and what I'm asking, yeah, but what I'm asking now is, what tactics would you ask them to use? Now so maybe one thing you were talking about is you can ask them to have a delegation of people to go and talk to those. That's another way you could do it. Was there another one?
Advertising.
Okay, and let me just mention a few. There's a guy named Gene Sharp who did a book that's about this thick, about, maybe it's only about that thick, but it's a big book, about all the tactics he could find in all the groups in history that have used nonviolent direct action for social change. And he came up with 198, and then he found 12 more. And I wrote down a list of about 20 of them that might possibly be used in one way or another. Like, let's say the governor won't meet with you, and you got to get this bill signed, right? So you could have a public indictment of the governor for being uncaring toward these poor adoptees whose lives are in danger because they don't have their health histories. You know, you can go to the press. This thing about delegations. There's a lot of these are overlapping here. Fraternizing with the person and trying to make friends and persuade, and et cetera, et cetera. Having a vigil. You know, like people just stand at the office. And in fact, we did that one time in the state capitol about another issue, but it was very effective. Skits, in other words, guerrilla or street theater, marches. Oh, a mock funeral, or maybe even a real funeral, I mean, of somebody who died because, make it a public event, somebody who died because, like this woman, I know of a woman 18 years old in New Jersey, she died of leukemia because she couldn't get her records, and by the time her adoptive parents found her birth sibling who could give a bone marrow transplant, it was too late.
That's like
You know,
the Margaret
right.
example.
That's right.
Margaret.
That's right. So at any rate, the thing that's important here is there's lots of tactics that we can use. And the point is you just brainstorm them out, and then you pick in the context of all this stuff, you know, what, you know, like, will it fit with our goal? See, here's the question of blackmail. Does blackmail fit? Yeah, but would blackmail fit with what we want, which is openness and honesty, right? We might have to say to ourselves, the means and ends don't fit.
There's different kinds of blackmail. You know.
Okay. And then the question is, will attack, if we say, let's have a march of 10,000 people. Well, if we only got 50 members, we can't have a march, you know what I mean? Or allies, you know, like if you say, okay, well, we're going to go sit in. But all these groups say, well, we're not sitting in. Well, maybe then you don't want to do that. And then the last thing is it a tactic that's going to work on that target? So all those things, you brainstorm them out, and then you pick the one that fits in that context. So we've had a hand up here, like desperately waving, so I want to hear what you have to say, and then we'll close up. Go ahead.
Sort of to like infiltrate other established groups, or like a community.
Infiltrate the enemy.
Who are you talking about?
Just like other established groups,
Like?
Joining the
PTA, you know.
Okay, so, just the word infiltrate to me sort of has a negative connotation, like you're subvert them. But basically you want to get them, join them and get them on your side. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Or
guest
join.
speakers.
Yeah, okay, yeah, speakers, right, that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's...
Infiltrate groups who are opposed to it within the region and become members of their group and then raise the issues and push
And then make a debate inside the opponent's camp. Okay, there you go. So there's a way that you might do that. Okay, we're out of time. And I want to thank you all for coming. I do want to ask you to please fill out the workshop evaluation before you go. And I guess that's it. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Can I see that one sentence?
This concludes this session.